And Community Secretary Robert Jenrick set out a plan to resolve the cladding crisis in England, the failure of public and private sectors that became apparent with the Grenfell Tower fire. The wrong cladding, unsafe buildings, unsellable flats. It's still paralysing a section of the property market. It's causing massive anguish to hundreds of thousands of flat owners. It's been building for years. We've featured it on this programme for months. And we've had many questions for Robert Jenrick, and I'm happy to say he joins us now. Welcome to PN, Mr. Jenrick.
Hello, good evening.
Good. Right. Let's start with the principle on leaseholders not paying, because many people had heard a mantra, the leaseholders, the flat owners, shouldn't pay for other people's mistakes. And I suppose one way of interpreting what you've done yesterday is to say leaseholders don't need to pay for cladding if they live in tall buildings, but if they live in smaller buildings, they do need to pay. Is that right?
No, we've always said that leaseholders shouldn't have to pay. They're the innocent parties in this situation. They're people who've done the right thing, they've bought their own home and then found themselves in an invidious situation, and it could be any one of us. What we wanted to see are the builders, the developers, the building owners step up and pay for the costs of these mistakes. And to some extent, that has happened. With the removal of ACM cladding, for example, on buildings over 18 metres, about 50% of that cost has been borne by the building owners.
That's
and we're still seeing some
the Grenfell
of the
cladding, the specific one.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The problem's obviously the most unsafe form of cladding. Exactly. The type that was on Grenfell Tower. And we're still seeing some developers come forward. Persimmon announced yesterday that it was allocating, I think, £70 million towards the remediation of some of the buildings.
But I just want to cut to the chase. The leaseholders are paying if they live in a building below 18 metres. You're going to lend them the money, or you're going to lend their freeholder the money, but they're going to pay £50, up to £50 a month, more or less in perpetuity, to cover the cost of that.
No, what we're saying is that we don't want the leaseholders to pay. We want the cost to be borne by the building owners, the developers, the warranty holders and the insurers. Where that's not happening, for a number of reasons, some of these building owners are refusing to pay, some don't exist anymore, some of these are shell companies, in the British Virgin Islands. In those situations, we think exceptionally the state should and will step in to help leaseholders. And
but they'll pay it back. And they're different for the ones in over 18 metres.
No, for the buildings over 18 metres, high-rise buildings, that's 6 stories and higher, where the risk is much higher, according to all the independent experts. The state's going to pay for all the cladding to be remediated. For the lower-rise buildings, those between 4 and 6 stories, or 11 to 18 metres, where we're advised the risk is much lower, and in many cases the cladding won't need to come off.
Yeah, but in some it will need to come off, and they'll have to pay ultimately through the loan scheme. And I think wonder whether that would be a disappointment, because they had been told they wouldn't have to pay, and it seems...
Just to clarify, it will be a mix there of the state and the leaseholder, because of course the financing scheme we're suggesting is a very generous one and quite an expensive one to create and to manage, because what it says to the leaseholder is that you'll never need to pay more than £50 a month.
Your colleague Stephen McParland, Tory MP, who's been campaigning on this issue, tweeted it is a betrayal of millions of leaseholders. It's not good enough. He called it shocking incompetence, in fact. But essentially, the leaseholders are going to have to foot a very substantial part of the bill in those buildings where they need to take it down, the cladding down, albeit smaller buildings than the tall towers. And we should just acknowledge that would be a disappointment to people who've been told leaseholders won't pay.
Too much into one person's comments. What we have done this week is a very substantial intervention. This will bring the total amount of government, taxpayers' money being spent to address this issue to over £5 billion. And the financing scheme itself may well cost billions of pounds as well, depending on how many people take it up. So somewhere between £5 and £10 billion of taxpayers' money is going to go into this. We don't do this often. This is a very unusual situation. Normally, whether it's flooding or subsidence or other terrible things that can happen to people's homes, the individual pays. But we've chosen to do it because we think this is a particularly difficult and unfortunate situation. And for fairness and for safety, it's right that the taxpayer steps in and makes a very significant contribution.
The Housing Select Committee estimated the total costs for remediation at about £15 billion. Obviously, you're spending £5 billion, maybe a bit more with the loan scheme that will obviously require repayment. Do you accept the £15 billion, the £15 billion cost? What do you estimate the total is?
Well, it depends what you're referring to there. There's a cost of removing cladding where it's absolutely necessary to do so because there's a risk to life. There's also, in these buildings, as in many others across the country, a number of other defects that one could set out to correct, like fire doors, like balconies, like insulation, like poor building materials, like the use of inadequate use of fire breaks. And that inevitably would be a much more significant cost. But what we're focusing on, and I think this is the right thing to do, it's on the basis of the independent evidence, is cladding. Because the advisors say that the most unsafe feature of high-rise buildings in particular, but also some of these low ones, is the cladding. So if the state's going to do anything, it should help to get the cladding off.
Let me just play you a clip then from one of our listeners, Tasha, who we spoke to yesterday. And she's actually a lawyer. She's worried about going bankrupt and losing her job because you're not allowed to be bankrupt as a lawyer. But this was one particular thing that was bothering her after she listened to you yesterday.
We were hoping that he was going to announce some form of extension to the Building Safety Fund, which would mean that it wouldn't cover just cladding, but all the other fire safety defects. He didn't do that. So at the moment, although there's more money in the pot to fix the cladding defects, we're still facing costs, even if those cladding defects are covered, to fix all the other issues, which can still be really expensive.
Now, do you accept that there was massive failure by regulation and enforcement of building regulations in the case of those other problems? And you've mentioned them, things like dodgy fire breaks or whatever, things that are not actually cladding, but which nevertheless may cost a lot to remediate.
I think there's mounting evidence that there's been very shoddy practices amongst some of the builders and developers. We've seen at the Grenfell inquiry already, and there'll be more evidence no doubt in the months ahead, allegations of dishonesty and fraud from some of the construction manufacturers. And I think the regulatory regime has been weak, not in recent years. We're talking about over many, many years, successive governments. The inquiry that we set up, the review by Dame Judith Hackett, who was on your programme yesterday, said that parts of the regulatory framework were not fit for purpose. We're setting out to change that with our building safety bill and the new regulator that we've created. I announced last month I'm creating another one, which is going to handle specifically construction products. So I hope that over time we will have a world-class building safety regime so these issues don't happen in the future. But we are left with a particular challenge about those, obviously, which were built in the past.
But why would distinguish between the cladding and all the other things if it's the same regulatory failure that arrived at the bad outcome? If the state is recognising that it has done its job badly, it's induced people to buy places that are not fit, why would you distinguish between the cladding and the other costs?
Well, I think they are different for a couple of reasons. Firstly, the expert advisors tell us that cladding is the one which we should focus on because that's the cause of the greatest public safety challenge. So if you're going to spend taxpayers' money, direct it to that. Secondly, we don't yet know the full details of what has happened with some of these construction product materials like insulation. We're learning at the Grenfell inquiry, and I suspect over the course of the year we will hear some very shocking things, but we don't know that yet. And I think it's important that we wait, we learn that, and of course the judge will come back with his recommendations and findings later on. But the task for me as a minister is to balance up the interests of the leaseholder, with whom, for whom I obviously have huge sympathy, with those of the taxpayer, many of whom are not homeowners at all. That's the task, and it's one of the hardest decisions that falls to a minister, a chancellor, a prime minister. But you have to try to strike a fair balance between those two interests. And having given a huge amount of thought, the chancellor and I came to the conclusion that this is a fair settlement, that we're trying to strike the right balance here to ensure that the public safety work gets done, the most important remediation happens, that we do make the market free up, and that people find it easier to get mortgages and get insurance policies at sensible prices. And also that we make sure the industry pays its fair share as well.
Well, can
and
you
that's
get a
why
bit
we've
more
set
from the
levy
industry?
and the taxes?
Because what we sorry to
yesterday.
interrupt. What we don't want is every freeholder and every leaseholder to have to go through suing surveyors, architects, developers, professional advisors. Would there be something you could do to, if you like, expedite the process by which money comes from those who've made the mistakes and goes to those who have suffered as a result of those mistakes?
Well, that is essentially what we're doing, because the Building Safety Fund is the state stepping in to pay for the cladding where you can't get the money out of the building owners, and the money is going to flow pretty quickly through that process. With the financing scheme, there is nothing to stop building residents, leaseholders from taking action once you've got the financing scheme up and running. So I think the great advantage of that scheme is that you can loan the money to the building. The leaseholders can, if they want to, take action of the kind that you're describing, and then use that money to pay down the loans.
Let's hope the courts aren't clogged up completely.
Safe in the knowledge they'll never have to pay more than £50, which I appreciate. I'm not diminishing that. I appreciate that's a significant sum of money to many people, but I think it is broadly speaking an affordable amount for homeowners, and it's certainly a vast improvement from where many of them are today, which is facing life-changing bills. To go from that situation to knowing that the most you'll ever have to pay is £50 a month, I think is a huge improvement.
Let me play you another clip from a listener who reacted yesterday. Because yesterday in the Commons, you used this phrase caveat emptor, the buyer beware principle that you said underpinned English property law. This is what our listener Thomas had to say about that.
Outrage for me really was around the time where the housing minister cited caveat emptor about, that there's inherent risk into buying a property in England, and that, we should basically kind of swallow it. And that for me was just like really outrageous that the housing minister kind of like said that when it's been almost 4 years since Grenfell and the scandal is well known, and it seems like they're not really getting it.
I mean, I wonder whether you can understand the sheer anger. You take responsibility. You know that there are problems when you buy a house and a property. You get a survey. You get insurance. You buy sometimes from a state-backed housing association in a shared ownership partnership with somebody else. Are you not entitled to say you can rely on government to enforce basic fire safety, and to have the minister saying caveat emptor, it's your risk when you buy a place, is really bound to arouse enormous anger?
Well, except that wasn't what I actually said, Evan. The point I was making was the opposite of that. I was saying that English property rights are based on caveat emptor. They are based on the leases, the contracts, the warranties, the insurance policies that you sign up to, but that we are choosing in this situation to do something very different. Precisely what your listener there was asking us to do, to override all of those principles and to step in and to use the taxpayers' money to support them in their hour of need, because it's the right thing to do as a matter of public safety and of fairness. Going to the future, we want to have a building safety regime where people are properly respected and protected. That's why we're bringing forward a building safety regulator. We're having a bill that's going through Parliament.
Let's hope we don't get into this again. I mean, it's taken quite a long time to get here, hasn't it? I'm sure you're disappointed you couldn't do more to help people further. I wonder whether it needed to have taken anything like as long as this. The stress that has been caused to people while you have been working out this plan, which doesn't resolve it for many people satisfactorily. Could this not have been much, much more quickly arrived at?
Well, I think it is a very complicated problem. Lots of people are understandably, want to see things happen quickly, but it isn't an easy challenge to resolve. When I became Housing Secretary and the Prime Minister took office about 18 months ago, there was £200 million of taxpayers' money available for leaseholders. And that itself had been a struggle by my predecessor, James Brokenshire, to secure, who also cared about this issue. Today, there are several £billion available. So we have made a huge amount of progress in that time. And I've certainly been fighting this battle within government, because I think it's extremely important that we get this support to leaseholders. It is also important to say we've made a lot of progress on the most unsafe form of cladding, ACM, the cladding on Grenfell Tower. We ended last year with 95% of the high-rise
Indeed,
buildings
and that was
that have
a
that
very
cladding on
narrow.
them.
No, that has been that has moved, but it is a very narrow part of it. We could talk about this a lot longer, but I fear we need to go on to some other topics. Robert Jenrick, we appreciate your time. 13 minutes.